Welcome to another episode of the Signature Books podcast. I am Devery Anderson, and I'm the marketing manager at Signature Books. And I just want to let you know you can also listen to this and all of our podcast episodes at Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and Spotify. And we also like to place them on YouTube whenever we can, and that way you can enjoy watching as well as listening as you're doing now. So this episode today is from the 2023 Sunstone Symposium held in Sandy, Utah in July of this year. And this features session 173, which was called the Mormon Lives series from Apostles to Apostates. And it is given to us courtesy of the Sunstone Education Foundation. So we're grateful to them for letting us share this and use it. And it features a panel of 5 authors of Signature's Mormon Lives series. The authors who are part of this panel are Gary Topping, Constance Lieber, Newell Bringhurst, Stephen Carter, and Kenneth L. Cannon II. And for a little background, Signature Books publishes brief biographies about historical Mormon figures from across the belief spectrum. And so the questions asked for this session at Sunstone were, what new things have these biographies brought to Mormon studies? And these Mormon Lives authors will discuss their discoveries in the lives of the following individuals who they've written about: D. Michael Quinn, State Senator Martha Hughes Cannon, LDS Church President Harold B. Lee, author Virginia Sorensen, and LDS Apostle George Q. Cannon. And these are the ones that have been published so far. Others are forthcoming. And this session is moderated by Holly Chase, who will talk more about the session and introduce the 5 panelists. So go ahead and turn that over to her and watch the video. Enjoy.
My name is Holly Chase, and I'll be the moderator for today's session at Sunstone. The session today is the Mormon Lives series from Apostles to Apostates. The audio from this session will be available for purchase at sunstone.org starting August the 15th. Please type your questions, if you have any, into the Whova app, and we'll try and address them during the Q&A, or ask people to come up to the microphone here at the front of the stage during the Q&A portion of the session. At Sunstone, our motto is more than one way to Mormon. We want to foster an environment that allows many ways for people to express their faith. We invite you to help us to build that community where all paths are given a space to be better understood. Please support us in our mission by making a donation and subscribing at sunstone.org. So, about this presentation that we're going to hear today. Signature's Mormon Lives series publishes brief biographies about historical Mormon figures across the belief spectrum. What new things have these biographies brought to Mormon studies? Mormon Lives authors will discuss their discoveries in the lives of the LDS Church President Harold B. Lee, Senator Martha Hughes Cannon, historian D. Michael Quinn, and author Virginia Sorensen. Now, I'll take a moment to introduce our speakers, and we have 5 of them today. So the first speaker is Gary Topping, right over here. He is a retired activist and historian. He earned the PhD in American Intellectual History from the University of Utah in 1977. He's been curator of manuscripts of Utah State Historical Society, archivist of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Salt Lake City, and history professor at Salt Lake Community College. His books include Glen Canyon and the San Juan Country, Utah Historians and the Reconstruction of Western History. Oh, I forgot to add the date, that's in 2003. Leonard J. Arrington, A Historian's Life in 2008. And D. Michael Quinn, Mormon Historian in 2021. He lives in Cottonwood Heights, Utah with his wife, Mariana Hopkins, and their tuxedo cat, Marlo. So cute. All right, our next speaker, Constance L. Lieber. Did I pronounce your name right? Awesome. She's from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, married with 5 children and 11 grandchildren. She has been researching Martha Hughes Cannon for 40 years and is still discovering new things. She is the editor with John Silito, thank you, of Letters from Exile, The Correspondence of Martha Hughes, and Agnes Munn Cannon, 1886 to 1888. She also has published travel-related essays in journals from Australia to Great Britain. She has a PhD in languages and literature and is a dual citizen of Switzerland and the US and speaks 5 languages. Our next speaker is Newell Bringhurst, and he's the author or co-author of many books, including Harold B. Lee, Life and Thought, The Mormon Church and Blacks, Fawn McKay Brody, A Biographer's Life, and Mormon Quest for the Presidency. And Newell is right over here. Our next speaker is Stephen Cannon, and he's right over here on the other side of the room. Carter. Carter. Should have brought my glasses. Stephen Carter is the director of publications of the Sunstone Education Foundation, and author of Virginia Sorensen, pioneering woman author. He is the recipient of the 2023 Smith-Petite Award for Outstanding Contribution to Mormon Letters. And our 5th and final speaker is Ken Cannon, who produced this book, which is George Q. Cannon, politician, publisher, apostle of polygamy. And his biography is that he's a lawyer in private practice and an independent historian. He has published many articles in professional journals and lectured widely on legal and historical subjects. He is a fellow in the prestigious American College of Bankruptcy, where he has served on the Board of Regents. He has also been an adjunct professor of law at the University of Utah and Brigham Young University Law Schools, and served as a Fulbright Scholar on the University of Helsinki's Faculty of Law. Cannon is married to Ann Edwards Cannon and lives in Salt Lake City. So these are our presenters. And also I just want to remind everyone, Sunstone is an open forum. Therefore, the presenters' opinions and histories are of their own. Now I'll give the floor to our presenters.
I thought I might begin with a word about the series that we've all participated in, this brief Mormon Lives series. It is inspired by the Penguin Brief Lives series, which many of you may know about. They've been going on for a long time. And the idea is that if you get interested in Mozart, for example, you might not want to read Maynard Solomon's 600-page definitive biography. Instead, you can read Peter Gay's 150-page biography, and that may be all you want to know about Mozart. That was my experience, in fact. So we're hoping that these will be accessible where larger biographies may be a little bit intimidating. I thought that I would begin by kind of telling you what kind of book my book is. My book and Stephen Carter's book are quite similar. They're both literary biographies. My opinion has always been that historians lead pretty humdrum lives, and ordinarily they're probably not worth biographies because of the colorful nature of their career. Mike Quinn would be something of an exception to that because he became quite well known for a brief period of time. But my book is a literary biography. It has a biographical narrative and up to a point for the first few chapters, and then the narrative just kind of vanishes, And I have a series of chapters on each of Mike's books, and then the narrative finally comes back in the end. Similar to Stephen's book, which has plenty of biographical stuff about Virginia Sorensen, but it's mainly concerned with talking about her novels. So that's the kind of book that I've written. So I thought what I would do for the rest of my presentation is to kind of survey the brief historiography of Mike Quinn and try to explain to you where I think my book fits into that. Stephen has asked me to talk about what's new, what have I found that's new about Mormon history. So I think I can fit it into the historiography of Mike Quinn. The historiography of Mike Quinn is quite limited. It begins with an essay of his called On Being a Mormon Historian and the Aftermath. This was a talk that he gave to the Phi Alpha Theta chapter at BYU in 1981. Phi Alpha Theta, as most of you probably know, is the National Honor Society for History majors. And it was in large part a response to two articles by Boyd K. Packer, lambasting the idea of honest and true history, which of course was Michael Quinn's bread and butter. And he goes after Packer with hammer and tongs. It's a very entertaining article and very inspiring article. Well, but he also begins by talking a lot about his early life and how he got involved in doing Mormon history by indexing the Bible and the Mormon scriptures and stuff like that. So there's a lot of good biographical data in there. The second item, there are 5 items altogether I want to talk about here. The second one is an essay by Levina Fielding Anderson called DNA Mormon, D. Michael Quinn. And that appeared in an anthology, once again published by Signature Books in 2002, I think it was, called Faithful History. And it's a really warm-hearted article. Everybody should do themselves a favor reading Levina's wonderful article about their deep friendship and her appreciation for Quinn's ability. And you get some really good insights into his historiography and into his personality from that. The third item of these 5 would be my book, D. Michael Quinn, Mormon Historian, which has appeared just, a couple of years ago. And I will talk about how that fits into the sequence at the end of my presentation here. Third one is called DNA Mormon, once again, and it's an anthology of articles, papers presented at the Quinn conference that Ben Park put together a year or 2 ago at the University of Utah. And that is just a marvelous collection of essays which cover a wide range of topics about Quinn's life and work. I think my favorite essay in there is Gary Bergero's memoir of his testy relationship with Quinn, which I came to experience a little bit of myself while I was writing the book. I was just telling Joe Geisler, nobody ever had a simple relationship with Mike Quinn, and Gary Bergero certainly did not. And the final book is one that has yet to be appeared, and I am just dying to see it. One of the main sources that I used in writing my biography was a memoir called Chosen Path, which Mike worked on over a period of years. It's a very long, over 300-page memoir of his life. And when I got started working on it, I told Mike that I had that Chosen Path, and he said, well, there's a much longer version of that which you don't have. And he didn't offer to give it to me, so I didn't pursue that. I just assumed that it was in his papers at Yale, and I wasn't about to go to Yale to get access to it. Well, it turns out I was wrong. He had it in his possession as we were talking on the phone. And at the time of his death, and his kids found that there in his condo in California. And they gave Signature Books the permission to publish that as a book. And our friend Barbara Jones Brown is working on that now, and I haven't seen her at the conference here yet, but I'm going to try to build a fire under her if she hasn't got it ready. And I'm going to offer to hold the midnight lantern for her to speed up her progress. I'm just dying to see that. One of the nice things about Gary Bergero's memoir of his relationship with Quinn is several quotes that he gives from this larger memoir, and they are just stunning. In fact, one of them, if I had had it when I wrote my book, I would have built my entire biography around it, but of course I didn't. So there's that. That's the last item in the Quinn historiography. Now, where does my book fit into this? I think my book kind of ties it all together. My book is the first comprehensive look at Quinn's life and his work. And if you regard that as kind of the centerpiece, then you can spread out into other people's memoirs of their relationship with him and of his biography. So I'm hoping that it will fulfill that role. I will just kind of predict, and as a historian, I very much dislike making predictions, but I think probably we won't see anything more major about Quinn for some time until somebody has the time and the energy to get into that massive Quinn collection in the Yale Library. So I'm hoping that these 5 works that I've told you about will stave off our appetite for more information on Quinn until such a person comes along. Thank you.
Before I start, I want to say a word about D. Michael Quinn. I met him on a radio program. We were both, there were a couple other people on it. I no longer recall what it was. And he was such a gracious person. Then in the course of my research, I had a few questions for him, and I called him up, and he was just delightful. And I was so sorry to hear of his passing, because I would have liked to have had more conversations with him. I had written a 350-page biography of Martha Hughes Cannon. So you can imagine, let's see, it took some work to reduce it down to 100 pages. And I wrote most of it between 2015 and 2020 when I was living in Hangzhou, China with my husband. We fled just in front of the pandemic and came back here. The reason I could research and write a biography about a woman who basically was born, bred, and then in Utah, died in California from China is because there are no records. Her son famously burnt all of her papers, her journals, anything that she had left behind at her request. And so what was left to use for sources was her letters to her husband. I had that copy of that book. Newspaper articles, which you can access online. And that was it. That really was it. It was a difficult undertaking. And when I finished writing this, like most biographers, you write a period. Yes, finally done. The thing about writing a biography is that you are never done. Stephen asked me to talk about what impact this slim volume had on Mormon studies. I'm afraid I'm going to mess something up if I touch this computer.
No, the computer's fine.
Is it? Oh, so I set this here. Okay, that'll make it a lot easier. Okay, when I wrote an article on Martha Hughes Cannon in 1976, which was published in the Utah Historical Quarterly. That was the first thing that had been written about her since about 1932. In between, she had disappeared off the radar of people interested in Mormon history. The things written in 1932 were highly hagiographic. They were based on her daughter Elizabeth's stories about her mother. And the interesting thing was, I asked her great-great-grandson, I said, do you believe everything Elizabeth wrote about her mother? He said, absolutely, it's all true. Well, it's not. And that's the problem when we're writing about family, right? Because what she wrote, she originally wrote that the youngest daughter, Annie, was born in Wales, which is true. And then later she wrote Annie was born in New York, which is not true. So already there's a contradiction. And several other things she wrote reflected family myth and family stories rather than historical fact. There was a biography written in 2009 by Mari Grania. And for the most part, it's a decent biography. Parts of it are really well-researched, others are more superficial. The problem with Grania's biography is that in the course of her research, she heard about the September 6th and was intrigued. And so the last chapter or two of her biography of Maddie focused on the September 6th, which had nothing to do with Maddie. She was long dead. And one reviewer called it a tenditious rant, which it was. So that was unfortunate, because what could have been a really good first foray into a full-length biography of this woman sort of ended in, So I tried to write what was true. I had some experience writing what wasn't true. I interviewed a friend of mine in Switzerland over several years about his experiences after World War II in Germany. He was 10 years old when the war ended. And it was very difficult to sift out fact from fiction, from what he actually saw and then what he thought he saw, and then what he'd incorporated into his memory because of movies he saw. That happens to all of us. So I think it's important now to have a biography out there that is not based on family stories or what we wish had been, but is, as best I could make it, based on what had happened. That leaves a great gap, because Maddie was in the newspapers from the time, even before she went to medical school, until she, and of course, elected as state senator in 1896 and served 2 terms, and then boom, gone. She disappeared from the radar. The birth of her 3rd child really destroyed her career. And people speculate, oh, it must have been so disappointing. But no, she pivoted. She never did run for office. She gave a few speeches, tried to raise a few funds. California was ecstatic, writing in I think it was a San Francisco newspaper, Maddie Cannon is coming to California and she will help our women get the vote. No, she didn't. She didn't do anything of the sort. She had decided to devote herself to her family, because that's what she had left. Her later letters are sad. She was going through what must have been the most horrific menopause on record. And she further suffered from congestive heart failure. And she thought she was going crazy, because this sort of thing does play with your mind. But she still knew what she could and couldn't do. Medicine was her first love, and it remained her first love until her death. And so I mostly only have questions about the end of her life. Why did she abandon politics altogether? She didn't have to. She never could have been elected state senator again. Her name had even been bandied about for U.S. senator. But she could have run for city recorder of some place or things like that, but she chose to abandon politics pretty much altogether. And she kept her family together. And the other thing that kept her family together was Gwendolyn, this 3rd child that ended her political career. This is my most, treasured possession for a woman, where we have no extant records about the last 30 years of her life. And we wonder, why did she do this? Why didn't she do that? What did she think about things? Oh, we don't know. But in this book, which someone found and bought and gave to me, she has penciled in references to her daughter Gwendolyn. This is the only extant proof of her deep, deep grief and the early death of this daughter, who died about 3 years before Maddie herself did. The other thing that I think is interesting about writing a biography, it's not only that there's so many questions, sometimes things just show up. In this book, I wrote that she left medical school, graduated from the University of Michigan, and decided to go to Philadelphia to attend the auxiliary school of medicine there, and on the side went to the School of Oratory and Elocution because it had always been her goal to go on a speaking tour. Then, and as these things happen, you can't ask for them, they just come. Someone sent me a copy of a letter she had written to President John Taylor in 1886 as she was transitioning from University of Michigan to her next role. And in this letter, I learned two things. One, the speaking tour she was preparing herself to go on was not on medical matters. It was on the people and the character of Mormons to counteract the writings of Anne Eliza Young, which were spreading across the country at that time. She said, some people have even handed some to me. She says, and they read this and they're prejudiced. She says, I don't know if I can change their mind, have them, ask them, bring them to convert to Mormonism. But she says, because of the very subject, I know I can fill lecture halls and I know I can help disperse prejudice. So there's a very different look at this person than I had done when I wrote this book. And then to find out that her first choice was to go to the School of Elocution in Boston. She only changed to Philadelphia because that school closed just as she was going to apply. So, a biographer's task is never done. Aristotle famously asked, what is a life? And Heidegger just as famously responded, the answer lies in a single sentence. He was born, he thought, he died. And all the rest is pure anecdote. Our task as biographers is to sift through the anecdotes, choose the most pertinent, the most telling, the most true as far as we can determine it, and to include that. A biographer of Jacques Derrida was thinking about that. He wrote, writing a biography means living through an intimate and sometimes intimidating adventure. Whatever happens, he writes, Jacques Derrida will now be part of my own life, like a sort of posthumous friend. I'm convinced of one thing, there are biographies only of the dead. So every biography is missing its supreme reader, the one who is no longer there. If there's an ethics of biographers, it can perhaps be located here. Would I, as a biographer, dare to stand, book in hand, in front of the woman who asked that everything she ever wrote be destroyed, so no biography could be written, right? Stand in front of her. Would I dare? I would dare, but I would be scared. But, when we write the biography, we have to keep so much into account. We're writing about a real person who led a real life, very different from our own, I assume, or we would not be so attracted to it. Michael Quinn told me when I called him, I think that I read that he said, he helped me so much. He said, his history is what happened. Historical fantasy is what we wish had happened. And we need to be so careful that we do not slip over into historical fantasy. And so, anyway, That's my presentation. I hope you enjoy it.
I have to confess at the onset that in contrast to Constance and Virginia Sorensen, I found Harold B. Lee a most difficult person to like. Therefore, when Gary Bajera first approached me 5 years ago about writing a biography on Harold B. Lee for Signature Books for this series, I was most hesitant. I had never considered Lee worthy of my attention. In reality, I viewed Lee in rather negative terms. Given the central role that he played in perpetuating the Black priesthood temple ban throughout his tenure as a general authority and ultimately as church president, he was rock solid on that point. However, I agreed to move forward when Gary informed me of the type of biography he wanted. Specifically, a brief account no more than 100 to 200 pages in length. He further advised me to limit my research to previously published sources, given the limited access the church placed on documents dealing with Lee's tenure as a general authority. In fact, Gary was, as the general editor of this series, was really extremely helpful given his outstanding editorial skills. It's a much better biography than it would have been if he hadn't been there to advise me and give me useful pointers. The writing of the biography was a major focus of my energy throughout the pandemic year of 2020. In fact, I have jokingly referred to this as my pandemic biography. In crafting the biography, I relied extensively on information contained in two previously published lengthy biographies. Leslie Brent Goetz, Harold B. Lee, Prophet and Seer, and Francis N. Gibbons, Harold B. Lee, Man of Vision, Prophet of God, both of these published in the 80s and 90s. Both Goetz, Lee's son-in-law, and Gibbons, as secretary to the first presidency, produced what could be called authorized biographies. Thus, both authors enjoyed unlimited access to Lee's personal diaries and unpublished writings, a significant portion which gratefully were reproduced verbatim in their respective biographies. These proved most useful in my own work, providing enlightening insights into Lee, the inner man, reacting to the critical events unfolding around him. Also providing valuable information were the published writings of Lee himself, specifically his published sermons. I also utilized two important oral histories by Lee family members, a daughter, Helen Lee Goetz, and son-in-law, Brent Goetz. I obtained additional information from a collection of Lee's personal correspondence acquired by Provo-based rare book dealer Reed Moon, which he generously shared with me. My biography centers on Lee's impact on the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, specifically his unswerving devotion to church service within the broader context of his life experiences and multifaceted personality. Lee's complex personality provides enlightening insights into both the man and his ability to achieve. Of primary importance was his extreme intelligence, enabling him to succeed in all that he undertook. A second characteristic was Lee's compulsion to always be anxiously engaged in some useful activity. A third important trait was his quick action-oriented disposition. A final, albeit less positive attributes was Lee's fiery temper. This characteristic was frankly acknowledged by family members and close working associates. Lee's impact on the church was considerable over the 30 years that he served as a general authority, initially as a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, then first counselor in the first presidency, and ultimately as church president. Even before that, Lee distinguished himself as a facilitator of the church welfare program, which provided relief for church members suffering from the 1930s Great Depression. Following his elevation to the 12 at age 41, Lee further served the church implementing correlation, his pet project, a long-range program to streamline the church's organizational structure and upgrade its various programs and educational curricula. As church president from July 1972 to December 1973, he pushed correlation forward in response to the church's changing demographics and rapid growth. Notwithstanding Lee's brief tenure as church president, his legacy was profound. Correlation, or the Lee Revolution, as it was called, represented a major step in the quest of a modern church that enforced orthodoxy and obedience. Correlation helped to articulate the process of carrying the message of Mormonism abroad. But correlation had its downside, as critically noted by LDS sociologist Armand Moss, who states that, quote, it tightened the screws on a potentially errant church membership by producing a standardized and sanitized instructional curriculum, wherein intellectual inquiry was eliminated. In sum, correlation reflected Lee's basic conservatism, both theological and political, producing a centralized leadership and control with an emphasis on unquestioned obedience. Lee's lasting legacy through his conservative ideology was perpetuated in his active mentorship of those apostles who followed him into the Quorum of the 12. Most specifically, Spencer W. Kimball, Ezra Taft Benson, Howard W. Hunter, Gordon B. Hinckley, and Thomas Monson, each and every one who followed him as church president. Indeed, liberal-leaning LDS historian Richard D. Paul conceded that, no fan of Harold B. Lee, conceded that Lee would be surely remembered as one of the 10 most influential general authorities in the history of the church. In conclusion, I found the writing of, despite my reluctance, I found the writing of Harold B. Lee most rewarding for the opportunity to get to know and indeed to empathize with this most important church leader relative to his impact on Mormonism. Indeed, I have to admit, I came to respect the man for his drive and determination, even though, as you can tell, I find extremely problematic the conservative authoritarian direction in which he moved the church. But I came to admire his unswerving devotion to church service, which continued undiminished. He was a man just driven, despite his chronic health problems, which led to his unexpected early death at the age of just 73. If he were my age, he would have been dead 8 years. Anyway, in sum, I'm most grateful for the opportunity to have produced Harold B. Lee's life and thought. In this effort, I sought to embrace the biographer's ultimate goal, as articulated by noted biographer Paul Murray Kendall, specifically to elicit from the coldness of paper the warmth of a life being lived. Thank you.
raising this for you, Ken. So like Constance and Gary, when I started working on Virginia Sorensen, and when Gary called me, that was the first person that came to my mind. I want to write the biography of Virginia Sorensen. Why did I want to? Because 20 years before, I had read one of her novels in college, and I still remembered it. I was like, who is this woman? And she had written other novels, and so I said, Gary, can I write about Virginia? And he said yes, and I was all excited, and I went out and I looked on Amazon and found out there were no other biographies of Virginia Sorensen. So I looked and looked and looked, and I found, there's a thesis here and there about her books. There's a couple of articles here and there. Mary Bradford had done excellent work throughout her life, keeping her in the spotlight, as had Susan Howe, but there were no things that could qualify as an actual substantive biography of Virginia Sorensen. And I had never written a biography, and I was on my own and had to go out and do all the hard work of actually tracking down papers and reading handwriting, and it was great. I had a good time. But I called Boston University because they had all of her papers, and I said, hey, I want to come and look through your stats. And they're like, oh, her papers aren't available right now. Huh. And I never really got a reason why. Fortunately, there was a prophet librarian named Dennis Rowley, who about 30 years before had asked Boston University if he could copy most of the papers that they had and bring them to BYU. And so I got to go to BYU and research her stuff instead. And it was so much fun, especially the day that I walked out of the special collections and I saw chaos on campus. That was the day that BYU had sent out the email that said, all right, everybody go home for COVID. There was dancing in the streets. So anyway, I too, Newell had my COVID biography. It was my only biography. So this is the bizarre thing. Why in the world did Virginia Sorensen not have a biography? This just blew my mind, because she won the 1957 Newbery Medal. That's not just the Newbery Honor. That's the top award in children's literature in the United States. How could she not have a biography? And then further, she had written 5 to 6 books about Mormonism that were critical successes and had reached the New York Times, the bestseller list. How could she have gone unseen and unremembered? And besides that, these are really good novels. One of them is on my list of, the 10 novels that I would take with me to a desert island. It's the most exquisite piece of prose I have ever read in my life. And it's nice and long, so I'd be able to stretch it out on the island. Why had nothing ever been written about her? And there were a number of reasons. One was that she wrote about Mormons. And I can't think of any novels about Mormons from the mid-century that have made it up until now, no matter who wrote them. We've got Vardis Fisher's novel and Maureen Whipple's novel, both published by national presses, but nobody but Mormon history nerds knows about them anymore. And there's the sad thing that she also wrote some really crummy books toward the end of her life. Self-confessed. And so she had about 30 years where she didn't put out anything that really got on the radar. So she sort of fell out of the public eye. But she was extraordinary. Like Constance was saying about having a posthumous friend. I fell in love with Virginia Sorensen. I should not have written her biography because I love Virginia Sorensen. She had these letters that she wrote throughout her life to her friend Anna Marie Smith. And it's like having the most warm-hearted, the most intelligent, the most erudite, the most well-traveled pen pal in the world. And I just soaked in her letters. It was so much fun. And I got to write it all and make this biography about her and then dive into her novels. And so the whole reason why this adds anything to Mormon literature is because Virginia Sorensen will enrich your life immensely if you read her novels. If you have not read her novels, you have a treasure trove just waiting for you. Good luck finding her books. It's really hard. Signature did put A Little Lower Than the Angels and Where Nothing Was Long Ago on Kindle. So go pick those up. Read them. Those are not her best books. It gets better. So that's what I'm here to do. I came to remind everybody of Virginia Sorensen and tell them, you must read this exquisite work. Thank you.
How do I get this down?
Lower.
Oh yeah, you got it.
So Gary Bridger, my friend Gary Bridger, was a childhood friend of mine, knew that I was working on a group biography of George Q. Cannon's three oldest sons, who are the most interesting three oldest children by far. I mean, there are these three, and then it's another 5 or 6 years before there are any other children. One became one of Utah's first U.S. senators. One became an apostle. One was supposed to become both an apostle and a U.S. senator, but had an adulterous affair with his sister-in-law. Both his wife and his adulterous partner were daughters of Emmeline B. Wells. And so it's very interesting. He kind of failed and was a journalist the rest of his life. He was editor of the Desert News for a long time. He was an adulterer. His brother Frank, who was the second son, was a U.S. senator. He was a philanderer. And the third brother, Abraham Cannon, who was an apostle, was a polygamist. And so how can you not want to study a guy whose three oldest children are that varied? Abraham Cannon was a beloved church leader. Frank Cannon was probably the single most effective anti-Mormon in the history of the LDS Church. And they're the same age, they're 3 months apart, they're half brothers, and grew up together. What kind of complicated guy has these as his three oldest children? And that's George Q. Cannon. He was enormously controversial during his life, and he has a huge life, and it was hard to try to write it. I tried very hard to sort of capture his essence in what's probably the longest of the signature books, because I said, you can't write this big of a life in 150 pages, and they relented a little bit and let me do it a little bit longer. But just anecdotal, just as an introduction, you need to read the book. I think I've done a pretty good job of introducing this guy who is central. He's probably behind Brigham Young. He's probably the second most important Latter-day Saint in the second half of the 19th century. He's just enormously influential. Doing his biography is like doing a history of the church from 1850 to 1900. He's in the center of everything. He's the cause of most of this stuff. He is the movement. He is the mastermind. He is the mastermind of getting Utah to the state of abandoning polygamy. And once polygamy is formally abandoned, he's the mastermind of secret continuation of post-manifesto polygamy. Same guy. That's how he is. But I just want to give you a couple of Brigham Young, who he became kind of the central protege of, displacing Heber C. Kimball what Heber C. Kimball said about George Q. Cannon, when George Q. Cannon sort of supplanted him as Brigham Young's closest advisor, was he said he will shoot off like a rocket and come back as a stick, fall like a stick. Well, he was absolutely correct about the first part, the going off like a rocket. He didn't quite get the falling back to earth as a stick. But let me just give you a couple of quotes. When George Q. Cannon departed from the European mission in 1864, his mission secretary, George Reynolds, wrote, he'd been mission president there, quote, "I do not think it too much to say he was universally beloved. His kind, tender, unassuming disposition rendered him an object of affection. Wherever he went or whatever circumstances he was placed in, he gained friends. That's George Reynolds. This was not a view held by all. Detractors, while often acknowledging his social grace and charisma, called him the Mormon Richelieu, the Mormon Premier. Longtime Salt Lake Tribune editor C.C. Goodwin wrote that Cannon was, quote, the smoothest, sweetest, and most plausible sophist in all the round earth, end quote. The Tribune also accused him of being, quote, the most vindictive and bloodthirsty of all the Mormon priesthood. The Washington Post described him as a benevolent-looking gentleman, but wondered, quote, if his earthly tabernacle gives the but little outward token of the blackness of the soul within. And this is the same guy. Okay. Brigham Young's view of George Q. Cannon was he had extraordinary character of sagacity, wisdom, ability, and above all, humility and integrity. That's what he said to Thomas Kane when he introduced George Q. Cannon. And Thomas Kane became very close associates in trying to deal with the United States government. Just a couple of funny anecdotes, because you need to read the book if you want to get a real introduction to this guy.
Right here.
Yeah, that's the book. Thank you. So everybody assumed that all non-Mormons hated George Q. Cannon. Well, he once had to escape Utah to try to escape not being arrested for polygamy and unlawful cohabitation. He's caught in a railroad train, in a salon car of a train in Humboldt County, Nevada, because people figured out that he was on the train. The sheriff of Humboldt County boards a train, finds a U.S. Senator, Wallace Morris, who was a sitting U.S. Senator from Nevada, who was a good friend of George Cannon. They served in Congress together, and said, can you help me find George Q. Cannon? They walked into the room where George Q. Cannon was, and the guy said, he's not here. This is a U.S. Senator from Nevada who refuses to identify George Q. Cannon, who's on the lam. John Philip Newman, who was a famous Methodist, he was a chaplain in the U.S. Senate. He was a famous Methodist minister in Washington, D.C., very close to a number of U.S. presidents, had a debate against Orson Pratt in 1870. And in the Salt Lake Tabernacle, Orson Pratt, John Philip Newman, and Newman, kind of tried to orchestrate the agenda. Always have Mormons give the first prayer of the meeting. They always have an opening and closing prayer for the debates. And George Q. Cannon tricked him into having the Mormons give the closing prayer after the last debate. And George Q. Cannon then assigned himself to be the Mormon who gave the prayer. And this is what he said. This is according to the New York Herald. We beseech thee, our Heavenly Father, to pour out thy Spirit upon this congregation. He thanked the Lord for enabling the Congress to, quote, distinguish between truth and error, between right and wrong. We thank thee that we are not left to the vague opinions and assumptions and assertions of uninspired men, but that thou hast in thy goodness and mercy revealed thyself from the heavens and bestowed the knowledge of thy mind and will upon men. We thank thee that we are in this land of freedom, that we can welcome our friends and extend them a liberty which has been denied to us, that they can come into our tabernacles and plead their cause. So he gives it, and the New York Herald reports the whole thing and says he tricked Newman into this. While he was in England, he was interviewed at length by Charles Dickens, and Charles Dickens wrote an interesting article about him sending immigrants off in the Amazon in the early 1860s, which was an immigrant ship. When he was in England, he had his phrenological chart done by Lorenzo Niles Fowler, the famous phrenologist, who's an American, but who was in England doing people's phrenological charts. Cannon went in, Fowler recognized him, and I wish to heaven that I could find George Q. Cannon's phrenological chart, sort of like in Frank Joseph Smith's in the History of the Church. Anyway, fun stuff. The most interesting, two defining qualities of his were that he was absolutely fearless. He feared nothing. Meeting with a U.S. president was nothing. Meeting with the Prime Minister of England was nothing. I mean, he was absolutely up to that. if it's in the context, particularly if it had to do with his faith, he had absolute belief that God was going to help him and he was going to be okay. And he wasn't afraid of freaking anything. I'm his great-great-grandson. I'm afraid of everything. I'm afraid of standing here and talking before you. He stood in front of presidents who were screaming at him and just was totally even-handed and said, God's going to protect me. Anyway, read the book. A fun guy. And the second defining quality is that he was witty, he was well-spoken, he wrote beautifully. And his biggest saving grace was that he was fun and he was funny. I found an example of him singing a bawdy Irish ballad at a family gathering in the 1890s when he'd been a member of the first presidency for 20 years. And he said, I guess this is okay because it's just family. I can do whatever I want. So he was fun and then he endeared himself to me. And it was a wonderful thing. And I tried to do a good job in understanding him and fitting him into the context of Mormon history, of which he is like the central party after Brigham Young's death. He's the guy. Thank you.